Hi everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to do a deep dive into the tessellation controllers, the displacement controllers of the new material, and how they react when using them on a terrain. Now, I'm going to explain that with the static mesh, and then I'm going to switch to the landscape terrain tools that we have here in Unreal. Now, before we get started, remember the best ways to support the channel is by leaving a like, leaving a comment, subscribe if you haven't, and ring that bell for notification. That really helps me out. Also, there's a Discord server if you want to join in to a great community, and you can follow me on Twitter for more updates. Now, what I have here is just a plane that I went into the 3D program and I did some tessellation. So if I go into wireframe here or Alt-2, you're going to see that it's highly tessellated. One of the things that you need to take into account whenever you're using displacement is that whatever you are using needs to be tessellated to a point. So if you don't have enough geometry, your displacement map is going to start distorting. It's not going to look good. So always take that into account. You may not need to have something as tessellated as this from the get-go, but never use something like a bare plane with no vertices. Always go with some vertices in there before trying this method. Now I've already applied this map and we're going to tile it a little bit so it's not so big. So I'm just going to go for, let's go for 3 and 3. Also, if you are interested in knowing about these controllers, I have a video in the description down below. But let's get onto the displacement part. Okay, so I have not activated displacement yet, but what you see here are the default values. What we're going to do here is start from scratch and we're going to zero out all these values. We're still going to use the controllers, but everything's going to be all the way down to 0 for better understanding. So I'm going to activate these and I'm just going to type 0 in all these values, except for the useless. The useless is pretty much what says on the tin. It's useless. Whatever you do to it, it's not going to change the outcome. So I'm just going to leave it at that. All right, in order for us to see what's going to be changing, I'm going to go back into wireframe mode and I'm going to get out of selecting my plane. This is one of the things, if you want to see changes on your plane or what I'm doing here, if you're following along, make sure you deselect your plane, because if you have your plane selected, it's most likely that you will not see any of these change happening. Now let's start with the parameters down here. So when you're talking about displacement, you want to take some things into account. You first want to set up your distance fade. The distance fade means what is the distance between your camera and the terrain for the tessellation to start. You have to define that, because yes, you could just tessellate the whole terrain. That's all well and good, but that's going to be a resource hog. So even if you're doing cinematics, we are going to try to be optimized here. So you want to tessellate as much as your camera can see, and anything further than that will be just a waste of resources. After that, we have to set up our tessellation multiplier. So the tessellation multiplier is going to behave kind of like if you go into the 3D program like Blender and you have the subdivision modifier, it's going to be exactly like that, like a subdivision modifier or the Turbo Smooth in 3ds Max, whatever program you've used before. So let's get started with this. Now I'm going to let's start with the distance fade of 2500, and I'm going to do a tessellation of something insane like 100, and you're going to see that it's starting to grow right here. So everything that's from below your camera and up until that distance is going to be tessellated. So I think this value is a little bit insane and we're going to get a lot of lag. So I'm just going to change this to 25 so it's a little bit more reasonable. Now I could increase this, and let's say I want to do 5,000. So as you can see, that actually increased the distance of the tessellation. And if I do 7,000, we could keep going. Now when it comes to the distance fade offset, this is kind of like moving the goalpost, so moving the edge a little bit further in. So this is going to really help you out when it comes into just increasing the distance of your edge. So if I'm looking at something this way and I increase, let's say I have a distance phase of 2500 and I do 500, what it's going to do is it's going to add those 500 onto this. If you want your transition to be softened between the edge of your tessellation and the rest of your geometry, you have to kind of eyeball it with how much tessellation do you had in the first place of your static mesh versus the amount of tessellation that you are adding with your multiplier. So if I have this kind of tessellation here and I do a multiplier of 100, I'm creating a ton of new vertices. So that means that I'm going to have this kind of like straight line, that very harsh edge in here. Whereas if I do the tessellation multiplier to something like 10, I'm going to have a soft fall off in this edge, and I can go even lower to 5. That's going to help me out even further. And in this case, I would just do 3000 on my distance fade and increase the amount of the distance. Now, this is why it's so important that you have a tessellated static mesh already, because if you don't, then there's always going to be that harsh transition in between your tessellation part and your non-tessellated part of your geometry. Okay, now that we've talked about that, let's talk a little bit about displacement itself. So there's a lot of tessellation here. I'm actually going to go down to 4, and let's do 2500 and leave that to 500. I think that's fine because we are very close to the plane. So I'm going to go back to lit. And what I'm going to do is we're going to start playing with the displacement amount. So if I type a displacement amount of, let's say 50, you're going to see that this is starting to distort. And one of the tricks that I recommended in one of my videos is whenever you're using displacement, the best way that you can get the displacement correct is to look at what's on bridge. So if we go here to bridge, just click on the 3D and you're going to see how much that sphere is going to be displaced. So if you try to approximate what you have in Unreal to what you see here, then you will get closer to the original tessellation. So let's get back into Unreal and let's try to dial that tessellation down until we get the same displacement that we had in bridge, more or less. And again, we are having a lot of distortion here because of how close we are and how big this texture is. We have a terrain that is about 100 meters by 100 meters, and that is quite big. So that is why when we get close like this is going to look very pixelated and very ugly. The case here will be to go around here, go to tiling, and tile this to something like 15 by 15. And then you will see a little bit more of a correct tessellation. So yes, this is highly tiled, but it will give us a lot better displacement than we have before. So if we go to, let's say, displacement of 20, which again, it's still very nice. So you can see that we have a more pleasant displacement over here. We can tile it even further. And that's why wherever your camera is going to be is the most important thing when figuring out what kind of displacement you're going to have. Because if my camera is going to be at this distance, it's something completely different than if my camera is going to be this close. So your displacement and tessellation is going to be both different depending on what your camera is going to be. So let's leave the displacement at 20, and because we're so close, let's divide this even further. So we're going to increase the tiling to 20. You can see now this looks a lot better. And even if we go to our wireframe, so go to here, go to wireframe, you can see the difference between the tessellated parts and the non-tessellated part. So if I diminish this into, let's say 200 and 1000, you can see the difference between all these parts, how we have the terrain conforming more to this displacement map than what we have here on the distance. So that's why it's important that you take these into account. Now let's move into the landscape. All right, now what I've done here is I created a new level. That way we can add our landscape. And we're gonna do something very particular here. So I've already done this, but let me bring these values to default. Actually, yours should look like this, 100%. And I'm just going to, there you go. So we want a small-ish landscape. We don't want a huge landscape. What I'm gonna do is bring this back down to 4. This will significantly reduce the size of the landscape. I'm going to leave everything else as it is. But in order to get more resolution, and this is something that you could do if you just want to have a landscape to create a small section with a lot of resolution and without having a massive structure, what you could do is you can scale it down. So that way it concentrates all those vertices in the same scale, thereby increasing the resolution. So I'm going to go and switch this to 41, which again, as you can see, it really made this very high resolution, even though it's not such a big landscape. So I'm gonna hit create, and I'm actually going to go and do 4, and I'm going to get out of landscape mode. I'm not gonna sculpt this. So we have a landscape right here, and there's a couple of settings that we need to take into account whenever we are using the tessellation from the Quixel material. So if I go into wireframe mode, you're going to see that even though we have not applied, let me just turn off the sky sphere so it's easier. Even though we haven't applied the material, we still have some tessellation. And yeah, I have not applied any materials whatsoever. If you look at here, or if you look at here, there are no materials in there, but there is some tessellation. So again, this is something you need to take into account, because this can mess up the tessellation that you're adding with your material, because you pretty much will have 2 types of tessellation inside your landscape if you do this. This is something that I got from the Quixel support email that they send me about the landscape material. So I think this is really important, especially if you're planning to add a lot of tessellation here. Make sure that you either play with this, so take this into account when you're adding the amount of tessellation of your material, or completely take it off, which is what I'm going to do here. So the first thing that we need to do is go to LODs, which is right here. I'm going to bring this down to 0, and there you go. That completely went away. And just to make sure that we are using the tessellation from our material and not the tessellation from the landscape, if you scroll down, you're going to see there's a tessellation function here. So I'm actually going to disable this and bring this back to a minimum. So that will be 0.01. That's what was recommended to me in the email. And that way we will have more control of our tessellation by just using the materials. Now, what you could do is you could actually use both of the settings to your benefit, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to keep it to the materials. So I'm going to open my materials right here, and we're going to start playing with it. So the first thing that you're going to see, and actually let me just go back to lit mode, is we're going to bring this material into the landscape, and you're going to see is tiled to all extreme. It's tiled so much that it looks like a uniform color. The reason for that is because right now what the landscape is doing is adding the material per tile. So this is a material that's been created to be 2 meters by 2 meters. So it's tiling the material according to the amount of, let's say, tiles that it has already on the landscape. This is something that's built into this tool, and it's the reason why it reacts different when it is on a static mesh. If you remember before, when we added the material to the static mesh, it just stretched the material out into one single giant tile. And this is tiling for every single cell that is in that landscape. So again, this is something that is an easy fix. I just wanted you guys to understand that. So we're going to tile this a little bit smaller. So let's do 0.1 by 0.1. There you go. It's small, but not super small. So I'm going to turn on displacement. Just scroll down here. Turn everything on. And let's see. I'm just going to go back to, I'm just going to put this here. And we're going to go into wireframe mode just to make sure the material is working. There you go. So the distance fade, let's do a distance fade of 2500, or maybe that's too much. Let's do 1500. There you go. Okay, so we have a distance of 1500. We have an offset of 500. And let's do a tessellation of 5. Whoops, that may be too much compared to what we already have. So let's do 2. That's a little bit more like it. And like I said, I'm just trying to adjust to the geometry that I already have. So you cannot go overboard with this because the edge will be too harsh. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to lit mode. And we're going to start increasing the displacements to see what happens. So I'm actually going to go and do 15, 20, 100. And you're going to see that barely move even though I am 100 displacement. And I'm going to explain you the reason for that. If we go back into wireframe mode, you're going to see that there's barely any change on my landscape. Remember how much of a change we had on the static mesh and how little of a change we're having right here. The reason for that to happen is because the displacement did not tile. What tiled in this case was just all the maps, but the displacement, our displacement is being applied as one giant tile. That's why it's not doing anything. So I would have to do something really extreme like 500 in order for the displacement to take effect. So as you can see, right now you're seeing the displacement in action, but you're not seeing any tiling from the displacement. So this is one of the things that I wanted to explain you how to solve right here. So if we go back to lit mode, and you're gonna see that it's starting to crack and it's not looking good because we are displacing this so much. Once you do like a huge displacement, you're gonna start seeing cracks in your surface. All right, in order to solve this problem, what we need to do is we actually have to go to the master material. So we click our magnifying glass, and over here, double click to access the master material. Let's just bring this over here so we can see what's going on. And here in material attributes, if we scroll down all the way to tessellation, you're going to see there is a property called crack-free displacement. As it was explained to me, this is what's causing this problem. So if I uncheck this and I apply, you're going to see that something wacky is going to happen. It's actually going to compile shaders a little bit. And there you go. We have huge mountains all around this. See, that fixed our displacement. Now we have instant peaks all over our terrain, and this looks amazing. Thank you for watching, and I'm just kidding. Of course, this is not the end of the video. This looks ridiculous. So what we need to do now is we actually need to go back to our material. Easy way is just to click this magnifying glass. And in here, we can make our displacement some more reasonable values. So right now it's 500, which is, again, way too much. But we're going to do like 20. Or let's just do 50 so it's very apparent. But what you're seeing right now is that it's tiling correctly and it's actually responding. You don't have to increase the displacement amount, should never be this high, but this is only to show you what's going on. And you can see that it's actually working 100% different than it was working before, and it actually looks much nicer. So this also illustrates my point then to why you have to have a decent distance fade depending on where your camera is going to be. So if I'm at this distance, I think 3000 would be a little bit better, and I would still do 500 over there, just so the transition it's not so harsh. So if our character is walking at this, at this height, it's much different than if our character is over here where you can actually see the edge of the tessellation ending. All right, this video was for you guys to understand a little bit more about how the displacement control works, and I've gotten a lot of questions into how to bring the new materials into the landscape terrains, because like you just saw, it reacts a little bit different than it used to. If you like this video, please leave a like down below. Remember, there's Twitter, there's Discord. Thank you for watching, and now it's for real. I'll see you in the next video.